Well, welcome to episode 60 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about The Who's debut album from 1965, which came out on Brunswick, The Who Sings My Generation. And what I have here is the 1967 US first release, which differs slightly from the UK release, but not in truly significant ways, I don't think. And before I jump in, I'd just love to remind you, if you like what I'm doing, please subscribe. There's a little button you can click right there on YouTube. It's one click for you. It's a big moment of validation for me, and it feels great when I get another subscriber, so please do, and thank you very much. So what do I expect from this album? Well, it's The Who, but if you're a fan of The Who, you know that while there are some common threads that run through The Who's music, the commonality is sometimes a lack of commonality. Every single Who album is very different. Whether it's, sometimes their work is huge and epic and grandiose, sometimes it's intimate, sometimes it's funny and quirky and wry and irreverent, sometimes it's deadly serious. And so you never quite know what you're going to get. But what you do know that you're going to get is an album that bristles. Like, these guys are slightly square pegs being put into round holes. And that certainly is the case with their debut album here. One of the things I think it's important to appreciate about The Who is that although in later days, Pete Townshend is clearly the intellectual leader, he's the writer of the music for the most part, and is very much the face and the voice of The Who as far as the public are concerned. This wasn't always the case. In fact, it was Roger Daltrey who was a driving force behind the formation of the band, behind vetting and picking the various different players, behind choosing the name, which was his choice, and ruled with kind of an iron fist until he pushed it too far at one point when he beat the crap out of Keith Moon and flushed his speed down the toilet, which the rest of the band felt was one tantrum too far. They had a band meeting. Raj himself was kicked out. He was allowed back in 24 hours later, but only after he agreed to a much more democratic way of running the band. Now, they didn't leave all of the lunacy and the physical confrontation behind them. That was still very much be a part of their story. But when the band reforms after Daltrey is readmitted, it's much more of a collective and much less of the Roger Daltrey show. And you have to figure, given that the band also includes Keith Moon and Pete Townshend, two people who are very different individually, but also two people I can't imagine trying to control as such. Moon because of his general proclivities, Townshend because of the wealth of musical ideas just spilling out of him. But here they've come to a bit of an equilibrium. Now, the band also spent a period of time being, much as the Beatles and the Stones and other bands were, being manipulated into certain images or looks or postures by their management. They had been the Detours, then their management, Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, decided that they really wanted to capitalize on the mods versus rockers thing, position The Who as mods. They became known as the High Numbers. That didn't, like all these things, the Who aren't a band that you could just put in one particular slot. That didn't last. Well, here they're back to being The Who. And the general uneasiness about who they are and what they're being asked to do, what they're being asked to fit into, just leaps off this photograph as far as I'm concerned. This album was produced by Shel Talmy, with whom they almost immediately fell out over publishing rights, and as a consequence, there were some early pressings of this album, and then it basically stayed on the shelf because Talmy had the master tapes. And so there weren't really any CD reissues of this until certainly into this century. Part of the fractious story of the early history of the band. This album was dismissed by the band later on as being seen as something of a rush job, but I think that's unfair. I actually think this album, early as it is and as raw as it is as good a picture and as complete a picture of The Who. Not necessarily to say it's their best album, but it's as complete a picture of The Who as I think you're going to find, just because it seems to capture all these tensions and tendencies that were within the band that were going to drive them on to so many achievements in the coming decade. Side one starts with Out in the Street, which kicks off with a burst of very heavy guitar. Roger's really croaking one out here, but you can't fault the energy that he brings to this particular track. You've also got Pete already bringing in what are now kind of banal things to do with guitar, like rapid switching of the pickup toggle. But in those days, that was kind of cutting edge. Recalling in part that Lambert and Stamp had attempted to brand The Who as an R&B band, and The Who had kind of gone with that for a few tracks. Not this is in any way an R&B album, but there are a couple of R&B songs on here. Two James Brown covers, in fact. The first of these comes up as track 2, I Don't Mind. And I actually think they do a pretty darn good job of making this their own, which for a bunch of guys coming from an unremarkable corner of London is actually quite an achievement. It's followed by a song which is not that well known outside people who know this album. It's one of the deeper cuts called The Good's Gone, but it's a fascinating tune. It's really quite edgy And it reminds me a lot, strangely enough, of the Velvet Underground, just in the pacing and just the overall mood of the song. Pete plays his solo, which is pretty thrashy, full of power chords. And while they go on to do things which were moodier and darker and even more interesting, what this song hints at, because you know what's coming later on, is kind of fascinating to me. Then there's La 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 Lies, which is basically an attempt to replicate the kinds of pop that the Beatles and Stones were getting on the radio at the time. It's got Nicky Hopkins on piano. It's competently executed, but they were never going to be a pop singles band, and this kind of shows why. It's well done, but it feels like a sweater which doesn't quite fit. And there's some really cool things that are incongruous about it, like the guitar in the bridge, which is very heavy for the time. Then there's a bit of an oddity called Much Too Much, and here, so Daltrey I mean, these guys are young guys, they still haven't really found their identity, their management are trying lots of different things. Here, Daltrey is kind of trying his best Bob Dylan, and it's a passable kind of imitation. But of course, all these songs so far are really the preamble to the final track on side one, which is My Generation, which is, if it's not a political statement, it's at least a social statement. And it is just bristling with energy and defiance and also some tongue-in-cheek pieces like the stuttering, which I had initially taken to mean that Daltrey was essentially portraying himself as somebody who is young and insecure but thinking about his situation in life anyway. In fact, it's actually a nod to speed freaks, with amphetamines being, you know, preferred recreational substance of the mods, which is an interesting piece of trivia. So you just can join the pantheon maybe of great drug songs, of which there are thankfully many. And Keith Moon here, I mean, Keith's been playing very well all the way through the record, but here, the latter half of the song is really his place to shine, and his drumming is like a runaway train. Side 2 starts with The Kids Are All Right, which is one of my favorite Who tunes. I think this is the first glimmer that we get of Townsend's personality coming out in lyrics. The theme is a little bit of moodiness, a little bit of being a loner, and the more we come to understand Pete Townsend over the years, the more this song and its slightly quirky lyrical content makes sense. And it's also notable again for the introduction of passages of really quite hard, edgy guitar, without which, based on other parts of the song, this could even have been like a Byrds song. Particularly in the bridge, you really get Pete really working it out. It's followed by Please, 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 which is the second of the two James Brown covers. Not a bad effort at all. A great solo by Pete, and again, one of the great things about Aretha Franklin was when she covered great songs by famous people, she made them her own. Her own take on the music was so undeniable, and this is very, I mean, I won't say that the Who's R&B measures up to Aretha Franklin's R&B. I think that's a stretch, but this is not some milquetoast wannabe cover. This is taking a great song and turning it into a Who song, which they do very effectively with both these songs. It's Not True follows up this theme of basically poppy songs, slightly moody and edgy lyrics around being the subject of rumors and untruths and so on. But again, this juxtaposition of poppiness with then quite heavy guitar in passages, which is a formula they hadn't quite perfected here. My principal critique of this album is this all tends to feel a bit jumbled together. Townsend has not figured out how to weave the light and shade pieces together, which he does so effectively in Behind Blue Eyes. We're not there yet, but the juxtaposition is still exciting, even though the songs don't necessarily always work, because this one doesn't really work as well as others. Then you have a lengthy instrumental piece called The Ox, where you have variously Pete and Keith and John all wailing away at different points, and Nicky Hopkins joins on piano. Pete is doing this sort of heavy for the time, sort of distorted Ventures guitar bit. Keith is busy trying to drown him out the whole way. So I think it's just okay. There's some really cool parts, but Beck's Bolero, this is not. Second last song is A Legal Matter. I was always kind of surprised this made the Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy compilation, because I think there are stronger songs on this album which might have made that cut. The Good's Gone, for instance. I don't know how well the lyrics have aged. It comes across, Pete is a high disclosure guy, and you're getting a window into his soul pretty early on, and sometimes things just look a little bit bitter and grumpy in there, and this is kind of one of those ones, I think. Then the album concludes with another oddity, Instant Party, also known as Circles. This is a song with an unusual history. And it was the subject of a lot of the rights publishing fight they had with Shel Talmy. Incidentally, this is the first time in a Who record that John Entwistle plays a brass instrument, the French horn. Of course, he does so later on Who's Next and elsewhere. And this was, much to the surprise of the management team that they figured out he had that arrow in his quiver as well. So as I said at the outset, the whole feeling of this album is one of great moments, but an overall uneasy fit. They're an uneasy band, right? Look at them, look how uneasy they are. And there's so much promise here, there's so much talent, there's so much restlessness, there's so much energy, there's so much willingness to experiment and push the envelope. It's not a masterpiece at all on the level of, say, Who's Next, which I would consider a masterpiece, but it's at that next level. And as a debut, it's remarkable. They weren't actually going to get back to this level, I don't think, for a while. And despite the kind of chaotic sort of coming together in circumstances of all this, it's really quite an interesting piece of work. So I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.